Cremé Wealth Management, we come with no pretense. Financial advising, making money make sense.
Good afternoon. Wanted to take today to introduce you to Steve Blanco. Steve is a business owner and runs Small Business Partner and works, functions as and with the HR department with companies. And we want to have some conversation today around some HR topics, a lot of which revolve around COVID right now, because that's the question on everyone's mind is how does this impacted us, and what's kind of the HR implication on a lot of this? So, Steve, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew, and hello to everybody out there.
So, just like most of these, we've gone over some questions. So, wanted to kind of start to go through them and answer some of these questions that are on people's minds these days. So, COVID obviously has changed the workplace as we know it in many ways. Some of these changes are more permanent and some are more temporary. We can view some of these questions in the eyes of the employer and the employee. So I think you're kind of in a unique position to be able to wear both hats. So I guess, remote work, right? A lot of people, obviously, I'm here in my home office. Remote work has become the norm. I guess from your perspective, how is this harder and easier, maybe from an HR perspective, in managing employees remotely?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, there was a trend towards remote work before COVID. Companies were looking at the benefits of it and how engaged employees were. And so I would go to various employers and ask them to consider that one of the things that they may do as an added benefit for their workforce is to offer remote work. And I was greeted mostly by skepticism. I mean, there were a lot of concerns out there by employers about things like productivity, and I'll get to that in a second. But so this was really a trend that started before COVID. And then once COVID hit, a lot of employers looked at this as not only the best option, but in some cases, the only option. And I would say, that now that it's been underway in most businesses since March or so, many employers are realizing that you hold people accountable for the same things that you hold them accountable for if they were in an office. That's basically productivity standards and productivity protocols. And so as long as you do that, working from home can be very successful. And I'll go into some of those reasons. You asked me how it was easier for HR.
Yeah.
In general, and there's studies out there that prove this, but you have happier employees, and there's a lot of reasons for this. For example, there's no commute, or maybe it's a 6-foot commute, no exposure to sick coworkers. Even outside of COVID, we've got flu season, and sometimes people come to work sick and that spreads. And then it's a lot easier to recruit people virtually because it completely widens your net of where you can look. So for example, I live close to the Dallas area. And so if my office is in Dallas and I'm looking for people, I'm generally looking in and around Dallas. And with remote workers, I can look literally anywhere in the world. So that makes it easier. And in general, believe it or not, we see increased productivity at home. And then how is it harder for HR? You asked me that as well. I think building the culture, which I'll get to in a little bit, is more difficult, more challenging. You've got some short-term office costs that vary state by state. Some states mandate that those office costs at home are paid for and some don't. Let's see. I think, a lot of people are wondering what's going to happen after COVID. And I think from an HR perspective, convincing management to continue remote work after COVID is challenging. And, one of the things that I recommend for HR departments is that they have their employees keep a journal, the ones that are working in the office, to keep a journal of their office interactions. So in case somebody does get exposed, the employees don't have to rethink back to, oh my gosh, that was a week ago. Who did I speak with? Who did I talk with? But certainly from an HR perspective, getting employees to do that can be a challenge, but is highly recommended for
Right.
contact tracing. A lot of times people ask me, can you require employees to come to work? Currently, the answer is yes, you can. And then I get asked a lot how to measure accountability with a remote workforce. And it's really the same way that you would measure it if they were working. So for example, if I work from 8 to 5, but I don't get anything done, it doesn't really matter if I'm in an office or I'm working remotely. It's still going to be not acceptable to the employer.
Right. Right. So that was a good segue into, can employees be required to come in? Yes. Masks are required in a lot of places right now, if not most, just about all. I guess, what are some of the HR issues around that? Because people sometimes have medical issues where they have, high risk situations. They have a hard time breathing. They might have a job where they're on the phone all day, and a mask might, inhibit the conversation, at least from going as easily. So what are your thoughts on that as far as an HR, do's and don't do's as far as the employer, and how the employee should be approaching it too?
Yeah, I think first of all, one of the things that I'll talk about kind of throughout here is what happens when you've got a federal law that says one thing and a state law that says something else. And that's kind of the situation we're in with masks, where there's no federal mandate, but however, certain states have mandated the use of masks. And the answer to the question is always, you follow the one that's more favorable to the employee, and that's always going to be the state law. They're written to be more favorable, to employees. So in looking at masks, there's two situations. One is where it's required by law, and the second is where it's not required by law, but it is required by the employer. So, employers can write their own policies that say you need to wear a mask. One of the toughest things for HR is, how do you enforce this, given that people aren't used to this? And, sometimes people forget, they may be in their office on their own where a mask is not required. Somebody walks into their office and they forget to put their mask on. So I think the new norm with that makes it challenging. It's hard to form, a new habit like that. As you alluded to, there are potential challenges from a legal standpoint in terms of the Americans with Disabilities Act, potentially religious discrimination. And in those situations, the employer would basically follow the protocol with those laws that they would follow under any other type of situation. But I would say that it's important that employers make sure that they have written policies to govern this, and that they can provide training that they can demonstrate that they've provided, because there's just a different world that we're living in now.
What are some of the, you mentioned the American disabilities, religious freedoms, things like that. What would some of those examples be where someone, an employer would have to make sure they're accommodating, someone? Let's start with like religious, for example. Can you give a couple examples of these?
Sure. So for example, somebody might have a religious belief that they don't cover their face. and you want them to cover their face with a face mask. And so in a situation like that, you would essentially weigh the risk versus the religious accommodation. And so in most of those situations, you're probably going to rule in favor of the mask because of the safety issue. Where this typically comes up in the workplace is somebody might say, I have my religion requires me to go outside and pray 3 times a day for 5 minutes. And you look at that type of situation, and that's not going to create an undue hardship on the business. So in most cases, the employee would be granted that opportunity. Whereas in this situation with the mask, there could be harm to others. And so you would take all those things into consideration. With the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's kind of the same thing. So let's say, for example, I have a condition that causes me to not be able to breathe very well. And so I don't want to wear the mask because it further exacerbates that issue. The employer is going to again look at that in terms of what is a reasonable accommodation that we could make, and would it cause an undue hardship on the business? And so maybe a reasonable accommodation that we could make is that person works virtually, or that person works in an office that's not typically accessed by others. And so with all of these situations, you want to make sure that you involve not only your HR department, but in also your internal and external legal counsel, because all of these situations are going to be different.
Yeah, well, that's good stuff. You mentioned one of the challenge being culture. How can businesses during these times of people working remotely, having this socially distant in the workplace, having to wear masks sometimes, how can you maintain a culture in that situation, both from the employee standpoint and the employer standpoint?
Sure. I mean, I think that a lot of businesses have a challenge maintaining a culture when they have everybody in the office. So yeah, let alone when it's a virtual situation. And you have certain companies that are very well known for their culture, and they built it over time, and that's certainly nothing that they want to lose. And you have other companies who have not been known for their culture, but they see the value in it, and so they're trying to build a good culture. And in either of these situations where you've got virtual employees, it becomes exponentially more challenging because you have a lot less control over the environment in the home than you do the environment at work. So I would say one of the major things is that leaders communicate the desired culture to everyone and on the company website. So you have to make extended efforts on the communication side. One of the things that you can do that I definitely recommend is that you welcome each and every new employee to the group. And so the group kind of depends on the number of employees you have. But in general, anytime you have a new employee who's going to interact with others in that group, that's the group that I would recommend is communicated with. So a lot of times what's happening now is things are moving so fast, especially the hiring process, that somebody starts working, remotely, and nobody knows who this person is. And so that can start all kinds of challenges culturally. I think that employers, if they haven't written company values, now is a great time to write them. If they have them, now is a great time to recommunicate what those values are, and that those values also are, the values that we have, whether you're working remotely or in an office.
Yeah, so that kind of ties into another question about like handbooks, employee handbooks, protocols, values, like you said. This might not be the forever situation. I certainly hope it's a temporary one that we're in right now. Would a company go so far as to make these changes, even if it's just for the next year? while this is our current reality?
Well, you definitely want to do something from a policy standpoint. So there's a couple of options. Typically, the end of the year is the time that most employers choose to update their handbook. So we're kind of at the perfect time to go ahead and do that. And I would definitely include these things that we're dealing with now with COVID. Or you might want to write it more generically, or anything, kind of similar where you've got an outbreak. But if you're not at a point where you're going to revise your employee handbook pretty quickly, I would definitely recommend having some temporary policies in place, like a temporary telecommuting policy, temporary office policy, home office policy. If you want to stipulate, for example, what type of environment employees are in when they are on calls with customers, how they're professionally dressed, those types of things. Now's a good time to implement those temporary policies and get them out to everyone.
Gotcha. When we think about this being possibly a temporary situation, is there any rights that employees have that they should be aware of that are specific to the times we're in now, right? With COVID, is there, like we kind of talked about some of the religious freedoms, disabilities, but is there anything else that is just, hey, you should know, like for example, if you have childcare issues, that you have a right in some situations, or if you are sick with COVID and have a positive test, you have a right, and here's what that looks like for you. Can you speak on any of that?
Sure. As I kind of referred to before, the state laws and federal laws are going to vary on this. So it's hard to kind of give an overview, but there are certain laws that have been written specifically for COVID that give employees rights, like around FMLA, getting pay for a certain period of Family Medical Leave Act, getting paid that's generated around COVID. So yeah, there's certain rights that employees have, and at the same time, employers have very limited liability. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, requires employers to establish a workplace that's free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm to employees. And to meet that standard, OSHA is advising businesses to follow the CDC guidelines, including instructing employees to keep 6 feet away from coworkers or customers, taking temperatures, disinfecting surfaces, and providing face masks, hand sanitizers, and barriers where appropriate. So it's hard to say that those things are a right for employees. It's what employers are supposed to be doing. But until there's a state mandate, which there are in certain states now, or a federal mandate, which there could be in the near future, employers should do the right thing. But the employee rights are not quite what one might think they would be.
Yeah.
There's something called the FFCRA, which is a Family's First coronavirus response, and it requires certain employers to provide employees with paid sick leave or expand the Family Medical Leave Act for specific reasons. And that applies to all employees of covered employers. And these covered employers are most public employers, and then private employers with fewer than 500 employees. So there are some things out there that have been enacted to help employees out, but probably not to the extent that many people would imagine at this point.
Yeah. I've just heard of a few people who have talked to me and said, "Hey, my guy just got sick. He's got positive tests. He's been out for 4 weeks, and it turns out we've got to cover his pay the whole time." Or my secretary can't get childcare. So when their kids are out of school, she has to be home, and we have a duty on our end to not only accommodate but to do some sort of compensation. So I didn't know if you knew the specifics on that, or if that was just state by state and how that's kind of being rolled out right now.
It's state by state, but the act that I referred to is generally 2 weeks of pay. But you've also got to consider that many employers are covered under the Family Medical Leave Act, and Family Medical Leave Act generally is unpaid. However, your policies can dictate whether or not they can use their sick or vacation pay, or whether or not there's other payment that would be applied. So basically, follow the act, follow your own policies and procedures.
Gotcha. And know what those policies are too, right?
Yeah. Well, and you've also, from an HR standpoint, you've got to look at past practices. So for example, if you have an employee that doesn't qualify for a Family Medical Leave Act, but you've given it to them just to be nice, for one situation, and then you've gone ahead and paid them for a certain amount of time, you would be obligated to do the same thing for people who are similarly situated. So that's another thing in HR that you've got to look at, is not just your policies and procedures in the law, but what have your past practices been? And I will say that there are employers who have modified their policies based on COVID and some of the situations that you described.
Oh, awesome. That's good to know. So if an employee contracts COVID, how can an employer protect themselves from any liability that could ensue? Because I know, the trial attorneys are probably chomping at the bit right now with, have you or a loved one, passed away from a COVID diagnosis and your employer required you to come in? Or, I could just hear the TV commercials now. So
yeah.
What can they do to kind of protect themselves, and what can employees do to protect themselves too?
So there's not any revolutionary court cases out there that have been decided yet. But to your point, I'm sure there's several out there that are in the works, and that could change things down the road. In the meantime, if I was an employer right now, I would make sure that I followed the CDC guidelines that I'd mentioned previously. And if I'm an employee and I don't feel comfortable with the workplace, like a really good example is the one that I mentioned earlier, where coworkers just sometimes forget their masks. As an employee, I really need to communicate that discomfort to my manager or human resources and ask that employee be dealt with accordingly. And it's tough. I mentioned it earlier. We're trying to break habits that we've had for our entire life. But following the standards that I mentioned earlier, everything from, wearing masks to using disinfectant, barriers, whatever can be done would all be looked on by a court as sort of doing the right thing or doing what is reasonable.
Gotcha. So does the industry that someone works in have an impact on these ramifications from an HR perspective? So the example that I, gave there was, does a healthcare worker have implied risk in their workplace where someone who works in a bank, would not have the same, expectation as to, exposure in these situations?
Short answer is yes. So healthcare providers must follow federal safety guidelines to guard against contagion. And then other businesses who are not in healthcare are not obligated to do so, leaving it up to the states and localities to set standards. I do want to mention localities for a second. I've already mentioned that you've got federal law that says one thing, state law that says another. You follow the one that's more that gives the employee more rights, and almost always that's going to be the state law. However, it's important to note that cities and municipalities can also come up with their own laws that are more favorable to the employee than the specific state law. So that's one of the areas where HR gets very complex, is keeping up with these laws and knowing which one to apply where. But healthcare providers are covered under federal safety guidelines, whereas a lot of these other businesses are not.
So when we talk about jurisdictions, since you talked about, cities, municipalities, states, does it matter? Like, let's say I worked for Apple, and Apple is headquartered in California, but I work in Dallas.
Yep.
How does that work from a law perspective, or how the policy is set? Because Dallas might have a more stringent, more employee centric approach in this example compared to California, but my contract and everything is written based on California law because that's where my company's headquartered is out of, Cupertino, at least according to my iPhone it is.
Well, that is a very complex question. So, and that a lot of employers deal with because they're in multi-states. So there's a couple different ways that you can approach this. The answer to your question is it's where the employee is located. So if the employee is in Dallas, the laws of Texas and the laws of Dallas are going to apply to the employee. California, that you mentioned, has the most stringent laws anywhere by a mile. And so what some employers choose to do who have employees in California and other places is they write their handbook and policies based on California law, because they know that it's going to cover employees pretty much everywhere else. The other option is to have the policies kind of segregate. So you have a general employee handbook with policies in it, and then you have an appendix at the end that says, if you live in California, the following laws apply to you, or these are our policies. Whereas if you live in New York, these are our policies. But it becomes very complicated to write an employee handbook where you have employees in multiple states.
So how does that tie into our first conversation point on remote workers? So I'm interviewing for my, position. I'm opening it up nationwide because I'm not geographically limited, but my front runner in this example lives in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. Do I now need to abide by San Francisco law, even though the position is remote?
You do. So it's going to be based on the laws of the state in which the employee lives.
Complicated world, Steve.
Very, very complicated, and that's why we have attorneys.
So the thing that happens a lot, right, with the downturn in the economy and COVID is this major economic slump that we're in, and we're slowly, starting to crawl out of. So there's more and more people being laid off and having to look for other employment. And some people are in the job market right now just because of COVID. If we can kind of pivot to that line of thinking, and our companies hiring right now that you've seen during the pandemic, and if so, are their hiring processes changed? We talked about being maybe more open to remote workers, but if they don't think that's going to be a permanent change, maybe they'll still try to stay more local. I guess, can you kind of talk to that a little bit?
Sure. Well, first of all, companies are still hiring. as we kind of watch the unemployment rate's definitely higher than it used to be, but companies are still hiring. The major change is that they're typically interviewing remotely, either by phone or by video conference or both. So even if the company has plans once COVID is over, or whatever the correct term for that is, to bring people back to the office, they're still typically hiring remotely. So, it's really, really important for employees to get used to interviewing remotely. And like I said, a lot of those first calls are on the phone, not video conferencing. And then when you get to the video conferencing, a lot of times there are more people on the video conference than you would expect if you're only used to interviewing remotely. And the reason for that is just easier to loop people in because they're all available at their computer versus, being in the office. So,
Yeah. If someone finds themselves in that situation, they're, let's say they're furloughed. So the company says, hey, we're not firing you, but we don't have work for you right now. We got to get our numbers back up. We got to, we're only at 50% capacity in our restaurant. We need to give it time. At what point should someone start looking for another job, in those situations?
So a lot of companies are using furlough during this COVID, and a furlough is a temporary leave of absence. And usually companies will provide a date where they expect the employees to return to work. And then hopefully the employer, and this is important from an employer standpoint, they continue to communicate with the employee in terms of updates. So, we projected coming back on January 1st, that projection is still holding, or that projection has changed, and here's what it is now. And so if you're an employee, it really comes down to your personal choice to decide if and when to actively search for other opportunities. And note, and we can talk about this a little bit in more detail, but if the employee is receiving unemployment compensation, the agency involved, the state agency involved, may require the employee to actively search for work. So that's something to consider as well.
Yeah, that was definitely on my list to talk about too. So if someone has reduced hours or they're furloughed, do they have the ability to get unemployment benefits in that situation?
Generally, yes. It does vary by state. So for example, in Texas, the TWC, which is the Texas Workforce Commission, determines your weekly unemployment benefit amount by dividing your earnings for the highest paid quarter of the base period. So it might be a year or 2 years, divided by 25, up to a minimum of $521 per week. And then benefits are available for up to 26 weeks. So with that, my advice to any employee who has been furloughed is go ahead and apply for unemployment benefits right away. So for example, if I was furloughed a month ago and I'm just listening to this presentation and I go, oh my gosh, I didn't apply for unemployment benefits, apply today, right away. They generally are not going to backdate them. And so you would be able to receive unemployment benefits from the date that you applied going forward. So, and that's the unemployment benefits, like I mentioned, do vary state by state. But in general, if you've been furloughed, if you, through no choice of your own, you haven't quit or anything like that, you're generally going to be able to get unemployment.
In some furloughed situations, I've heard of people keeping their benefits.
Yes.
So I still have my health insurance, but I'm not getting paid. Is that does that mean they're not eligible for unemployment benefits because they have those like health insurance benefit, or would that not disqualify them in that example?
that would not disqualify them. So
Okay.
they would be, if they're receiving health benefits per their employer's benefit policy, that would not affect unemployment. But what may affect unemployment is, let's say when they got furloughed, they got a kind of a bulk payment. So they said the furlough is going to last for 6 months, but we're going to pay you for 2 months. So in a situation like that, what employment would probably do is they would start paying unemployment after those 2 months of pay had expired.
Okay. So that's for people who have been furloughed or potentially hours reduced, people who have been let go, have just been laid off. In those situations, I've heard of a lot of people that have been let go and they were given a severance. In the severance situation, do they have to wait until after a period of time to qualify for unemployment benefits? And is there a reason why someone wouldn't want to apply for unemployment other than thinking they're going to get a job right away?
So generally, yes, they would need to wait, but my advice would be apply right away. One of the things that you're going to get is a questionnaire that's going to ask you a bunch of questions about your wages. It'll ask you in there if they paid you beyond your last day, and you'd have to put that in there. And then typically the unemployment pay would start after the pay that they gave you in a severance, for example, had been exhausted. And then I can't think of any reason off the top of my head why an employee would not apply for unemployment benefits. There's really there's no downside to it.
There's no situation where it would be seen as a negative, where you had to fill out, an application and it says, have you ever accepted unemployment benefits? And you wouldn't want to check yes on there. Nothing that you can think of.
Well, first of all, if an employer did that, it would be illegal.
Oh,
So they're not allowed to ask those types of questions. That doesn't mean that you won't get asked. So in that case, you can answer it in a number of different ways, including, I don't feel comfortable answering that question. But almost every employer out there knows how unemployment works. Employers do sometimes get upset about it because they have to attend a hearing. They have to provide all this documentation. They think that the employee isn't entitled to it, but the court rules, the unemployment hearing rules otherwise. So there is a little bit of animosity out there for employers regarding unemployment. However, I would not suggest that former employees hesitate to apply for unemployment. That's one of your rights. So I would not worry about that too much.
okay. How can employees keep their health insurance in those situations where maybe they're furloughed without benefits or they lose their job entirely? What are your thoughts on that?
So in some cases, employers are required to provide unemployment benefits under COBRA. It doesn't generally matter how you left the company. Federally, that applies to if you have 20 or more employees. There are states that have reduced that for certain employers. But the best advice that I can give you is to check with your employer, as it generally also depends on how the plan is written. And the employer is required to give you copies of that plan. So I would just read through that and it will tell you exactly what you're entitled to under COBRA. Probably the most important thing is make sure that you make your payments on time. So let's say, for example, I left an organization, I've got COBRA for, let's say, 18 months. There's, again, states, situations where that can extend, but let's say it's a typical 18 months, and the company can charge me up to 102% of the health insurance premium. So whatever they were paying plus whatever I was paying plus up to a 2% administrative fee. That's going to be due on a certain date. Make sure that you pay it on that date or before that date, because if you don't, the employer can say you didn't keep your end of the bargain. We're going to take the COBRA away.
Mm. So that payment can really balloon up for people, because perhaps they were spending $800 a month on their insurance, and the employer was covering another $1,000 a month. That COBRA payment would then be potentially, 1836, right, with the 2% kicker.
Right. And, consider the situation where in some cases employers are paying the full amount. And that's kind of rare these days because health insurance has gotten so expensive. But some employers use it as a massive benefit because they know that if the competitor across the street, the employee has to pay $800 a paycheck or $800 a month, whatever the case may be, and my employer is paying for all of it. That's a big benefit for me as an employee. But do note that once I go on COBRA, they're allowed to charge me the full amount plus the 2%.
Yeah. So let's say someone is unemployed now and seeking, a position. Is there anything that you can think of for suggestions on ways for them to be, employed faster in the future? And we can get into some of those details as to even what you should put on your resume and what you shouldn't these days. Because, for some people, this might be the first time they were laid off in 20 years and they don't have an updated resume, and, just little things have changed. And can you kind of speak to that at all?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's a lot of resources out there on the internet that will help you write a resume. There are some that are free, and you just fill in the main parts and hit go, and it creates the whole thing for you. So definitely make use of technology. And it's just a lot easier than it used to be. You don't have to pay someone to write your resume for you, although there are a lot of people out there that do that as well. But a couple things to look at is, one, having a professional email address. So for example, if my email address is iloveguns@yahoo.com, that might not be the greatest thing for an employer to see. It may be great, but it may not be great for certain employers. So having a professional email address, the Yahoo part is fine. Just make sure that you're not that you're keeping it more business oriented. You can come up with references in advance because a lot of employers are already looking for those. You can call your references. You should call your references and say, hey, I'm applying for these jobs and I'm thinking about using you as a reference. Would it be okay if some employers called you? And then, a lot of people don't know this, but a lot of people will apply for jobs and they're like, I didn't even get called for the job and I'm perfect for it. So it's important for everybody to understand that the vast majority of recruiters are using software to search through resumes. So it's very unlikely that at the first point when you submit a resume that there will actually be human eyes on it. And this recruiting software looks for keywords. So then a lot of people ask me, what are the keywords? Well, it depends on the job. So take a look at the job description and pull out what you think are the kind of the most important aspects or words in that job description. Generally, the ones closer to the top will be the most important, and make sure that you have those actual words in your resume that you send to that employer. that'll help the recruiting software put you near the top. And then a lot of people ask me about social media and online presence. And you should know that as you get further down the interview process, a lot of employers will look you up on social media. So if you're on Facebook, for example, and you've presented a lot of controversial viewpoints on anything really, that could be looked at as a negative. So I definitely recommend that whenever you're posting anything on social media, that you look at it from the filter of how would a prospective employer look at what I'm posting. So just with pictures and, you know, things that you believe in, those sort of things, just be a little careful because employers are using social media to do research on you.
Can a prospective employer require that you basically show them your social media profile? Could they say, hey, pull up your Facebook page and let's take a look at what you have on there?
Sure, they could. But, you know, generally they won't. They'll generally just look you up, but they can ask you in an application for your Facebook handle, your Twitter handle, you know, other things. They can just put, you know, will you please provide us with the following? And you don't have to, but there's ways for employers to find out about your social media, even if you don't give them any information.
On the actual resume, there was a couple things that I know some people had said in the past, do it. Other people said, don't do it. What are your thoughts on, I mean, the one I hear don't do the most is don't put a photo on there. And that's just because then you put more liability on the company to say, hey, you didn't hire me because of how I look. Is that still the case, that's kind of seen as unprofessional to have a photo?
I would only put a photo if the job that you were applying for was applicable to that. So for example, if you were applying for a modeling job, or you were applying to be a news anchor, or something where your appearance is going to be a very important part of the job, I put the photo on there. In all other cases, definitely leave the photo off.
Okay. And an address. Should you put your address so they know, you know, where you're physically located, especially in light of, you know, your local law dictates how they have to, you know, potentially treat you?
I would put the address on the resume simply because it's something that employers expect to see. The downside of putting the address is, let's say, you know, I mentioned before that I live in a suburb of Dallas, and let's say that that I'm applying for a job in Fort Worth because I know that I'm going to be moving there, you know, in a week. An employer in Fort Worth may receive that resume and go, well, this guy's not going to want to commute for 2 hours a day or whatever it is. And so in some cases, you might want to put that you're moving to the location if the address on your resume is not close to where you're applying for.
What about phone number? Because I remember that used to be a thing where, you know, if you didn't have a local phone number, you were kind of seen as flighty, you know, oh, you're not from here. Does that matter anymore now that we don't have to pay additional charges to call outside of your state, you know, like we used to on cell phones?
I don't think the phone number matters hardly at all with a different area code. Again, you might want to put a disclaimer on your resume underneath the phone number that says located in Omaha, or wherever you're physically located.
Okay.
But it's definitely important to put the phone number because employers will look for it, and if they don't find it, that's going to not sit with them well, because then they've got to do extra work to try to reach you.
Right. Makes sense. And what about citizenship? Is that another thing that's expected on there so they know whether or not you're basically eligible to work in the U.S.?
Generally not, because they're going to have that on their application. But if it's a concern of yours, like let's say, for example, you have like my last name is Blanco, it's Hispanic. I may want to put a line on there that says eligible to work in the United States for any employer, if that's the case.
Okay. So I guess the last kind of question to close up this section here is just, any general interview tips that you'd have for someone that's, let's say you're working as an HR representative for a company, they're going to be talking to you. What are some tips that you could give people that are in these situations that have been laid off or furloughed and looking for another job?
So there's a lot of platforms out there that are free, like Zoom, where you can download it. And then I would definitely have somebody read you some interview questions. You can just go to Google and type common interview questions, or I could type common interview questions for an HR assistant, and you'll be able to get a whole bunch of questions, and just give those to a friend or a neighbor or a family member and have them read those questions to you while you talk into the video. And then go back and watch it and see how you're coming off. See what your body language looks like. See what your background looks like and is coming off. So there's definitely some practicing that you can do. And then at some point, when you get a video interview from an employer, there will be a request on there. See what platform they're using. Go ahead and download that in advance. Get really familiar with it, and practice using it if you're able to. I would definitely say dress professionally. Just because you're in your house, you should dress as if you were going into the office for an interview. Make sure that you maintain eye contact with the camera. There's a lot of tendencies for people when they're in a video interview, they'll look over at themselves, but remember the camera's up here. And then make sure that you silence your devices, your computer, your phone, any other. Try to limit distractions as much as possible. I mean, employers understand you're in your house. It might not be perfect, but do your best to make sure that there are no distractions. And then everything else, all the other advice is the common advice, that you've been given in interviews before. The only thing that's really changed is the medium.
Awesome. Well, this was really good. I think a lot of people get a lot of value out of it. So I appreciate your time in going through all this today, Steve.
Absolutely. Thank you.